Hello, my name's Gavin, this is Genre Books, and Garbaugust feels like a good time to talk about a period of publishing in the UK that is still largely a closed book to me. I was, however, fortunate enough to get the following book and read it in the last week. It will be the only non-fiction I'm reading during Garbaugust, I'm sure, but it was this, The Mushroom Jungle, History of Post-War Paperback Publishing, written by Steve Holland. Now, this was written some time ago, and I think researched in the pre-internet days. Not that there's an awful lot of information on the internet still about it. But Holland was able to speak to some people who were publishing at the time and had access to some other memoirs as well. Mushroom publishing isn't a phrase that gained much traction, but I think is a very apt way of describing the environment in post-war Britain. A clutch of publishing companies suddenly grew up out of nowhere in the immediate post-war period. And in the mid to late 50s, they mostly disappeared almost as quickly. There are very specific reasons for both their rise and their fall, and I just want to talk a little bit about it today. Although I've not read as much in Garbaugust as I would have liked, I have managed to squeeze in a couple of books that fall under this mushroom publishing banner. The first is The Purple Wizard by Volstead Gridban, and Volstead Gridban is actually John Russell Fearn. And the second is From Realms Beyond by Leo Brett. And Leo Brett is actually Lionel Fanthorpe. There will be a lot of pseudonyms mentioned, and I'll be looking at the ups and the downsides of those pseudonyms as we go through this. The publishing firms arise because of specific conditions, but they also start with paperback novels for specific conditions, and that's the bit I'd like to sort of tackle first. There is no great resurgence of pulp magazines such as there is in the United States. And it's for the simple reason that during the war, there were no new publications really permitted. Paper was in very short supply, and there were very few, if any, new periodicals. At the end of the war, there was still rationing in place, and paper was allowed for new companies, but on very strict quotas. I think the allowance was 800th weight every 4 months. That equates to a shade under 1100 kilos in a year. That's not enough to produce a magazine, purely because magazines generally were bigger in format than novels. Magazines also traditionally had lots of advertisements in them, and in rationing there's really not a lot to be advertising in the way of products. More importantly, a magazine had to be regular, and you couldn't have a regular magazine with such a restrictive access to paper. So the landscape of publishing was pretty barren. There wasn't a lot of scope for new writers to break onto the scene, because the existing remaining publishers already had their writers in place and didn't have room for any more, and because of these restrictions couldn't create new titles for new writers. But what you did have, with returning troops from abroad who've received their severance pay and casting around for something to do, is a few of them deciding to take the plunge and begin publishing themselves and applying for a paper quota. As many of these started as one-man bands, that is also no way to begin magazine publication. But if you could turn your hand to writing a book, there's enough there for a print run of 10,000, 20,000. You make sure the printer gets the paper and your manuscript, and you're up and set and running. So some of this happens in late 44 and 1945. It gains traction in 1946. And we see the first of these recognisable companies that stayed the course appear at this juncture. What they have to do is create a product that is reliably going to sell. This is no time to start experimenting with your great novel that you've been labouring over. You've started a publishing firm and you will need to make a profit if you want to continue publishing. So writers turned to the genres they know will work, and publishers who needed writers made sure they were writing to the spec that they required. There are strict word limits. There are limited genres for you to be writing in. Westerns are popular. Gangster stories are popular. Over time, science fiction becomes more popular. Some romances are popular. Not as many as you might think. The romance market was largely the domain of the women's magazines that already existed and had their own cadre of writers who were producing that material. But the presentation of that romance, and indeed the presentation of some other genres, could be spiced up. They could be made to look more alluring, and this is what happened. Take, for example, two books that came out in 1945, both of which were old manuscripts from the 1930s from established writers. The Wanderers of Time by John Benyon Harris, better known to us as John Wyndham, was renamed as Love in Time. Wizard's Isle from Jack Williamson, the American science fiction writer, became Lady in Danger, and they had the covers to match. I think people who maybe bought those books expecting one thing were, I hope, entertained, but possibly a little bit disappointed that what they had was 15-year-old science fiction. The novels of Paul Renin, a French writer, were reprinted. Just calling something a French romance had certain implications, and at the time French anything had certain implications in Britain. French letters were another polite way of saying prophylactics. The French disease was syphilis. It should be pointed out that in France, syphilis was known as the English disease. So yeah, that's just part of 1,000 years of fun we've been having with each other. But if you are writing a romance book, you will be more likely to sell more copies if your name sounds suitably Gallic. By the same stretch, if you are writing a Western, if you're called Tex or Rex or something strong, monosyllabic and masculine, then that's good. If you are writing gangster novels, something vaguely foreign sounding but quite Americanized is also a handy sobriquet to have. So pseudonyms were in frequent, constant use. It should be pointed out that because there are, at this point, alongside rationing, massive import restrictions in the UK to help balance our deficits, and as a result, there aren't any American books coming in. Allied to that is the fact that the British publications are only paying 10 shillings per 1,000 words. Now, at the time, if you're writing for an American pulp, you're making probably 3 times that amount, and we already know that that wasn't a huge amount that most writers were making. So there's little interest for American writers to work in the UK, and there is no avenue for American writers to sell their wares in the UK. This all helps the publishing industry to an extent. They have a captive audience. People are starved for entertainment. People know of gangster stories and Western stories from what they see in Hollywood. So dialogue that apes this dialogue appearing in the books sounds naturalistic to the British reader of the late 40s. The audience has also had their appetite whetted by the books that American soldiers had brought over during the Second World War. As I said earlier, these pseudonyms had good and bad results for writers. And there are two types of pseudonyms. Some writers are lucky enough to be associated with the one name. So Stephen Francis is Hank Jansen. At least he is until much later in Hank Jansen's career. E.C. Tubb was Volstead Gridban until he stopped writing as Volstead Gridban and started writing in his own name, at which point John Russell Fearn took over as Volstead Gridban. John Russell Fearn was also Vargo Statten and a number of other names as well, depending on which genre he was writing for at the time. And this is another benefit for the writer. They don't get known for one thing. They have the facility to be writing Western, gangster, science fiction, romance, whatever, sometimes simultaneously, and no one gets confused over what they're actually picking up. The other type of pseudonym is a house name, and this has more of a detrimental effect because this name can't follow a writer around. So a writer is tied to a publishing house if he wants to remain as Ben Sato, for example, or Darcy Glinto. Those names remain the property of the publishing house. And they could quite easily get rid of a writer, bring someone in who can write in vaguely the same style and hope that the audience doesn't notice. This does happen, and quite often people do notice. The use of house names, and to an extent the use of pseudonyms, also stops a writer making a name for themselves. So there are very few writers who become famous from the era of mushroom publishing. With no name recognition and low rates of pay, the only way to become a success, a financial success, is as a writer, is to become prolific. And there are stories about the most famous writers of the time mirroring the American experience of people like Max Brand, who are just able to churn out 5, 7, 10,000 words a day in, day out, 7 days a week, not letting up. Switching between different genres, switching between different books at the same time, and becoming production lines in and of themselves. A writer could have one book they are currently writing, 2 that they are currently editing, 1 waiting at a publisher, and 1 actually at the printers. And it doesn't stop. Even at a low figure of 10 shillings per 1,000 words, which can go up to £1, sometimes a little bit more than £1 per 1,000 words, can mean that someone's making possibly 45 pounds a week, which, when the average wage at the time is £8, £9, £10 a week, is significant. But it is completely draining. The publishers will take advantage of the writers. if a writer who's been told to produce a 45,000 word manuscript turns up and there are 47,000 words, it was not unknown for a publisher or editor to simply tear out a couple of chapters, bring it down to the 45,000 words and pay them for them. Hang the continuity issues that brings up with the final product. On the other hand, the proliferation of pseudonyms and bare bones skeleton crews at some of these publishing firms could mean that the writer take advantage of the publisher. There is the apocryphal story of someone who only employs an editor for 3 days during a week, has a writer turn up with a manuscript on a day that the editor is not there. The publisher thinks, how difficult can this be? They start reading the manuscript. This is fantastic. This is great stuff. It's authentic, gripping. Buys it on the spot, pays the writer, who they've not seen before, and the writer goes away. When the editor comes back, publisher proudly puts that manuscript on the desk and said, I bought that whilst you were off this week. Tell me what you think of this. The editor starts to read the manuscript, looks up at the publisher and says, congratulations, you've just bought The Big Sleep by Raymond Carver. The one thing pseudonyms could not do for writers, however, was protect them when the authorities decided that they had had enough of mushroom publishing. Specifically, they did not like the lurid subjects that essentially were selling. Sex sold, violence sold. The government wasn't happy about it. And from 1953, 1954 onwards, they start to prosecute publishers under the Obscene Publications Act. This act was from the 1850s and was usually used to suppress material of a religious nature that wasn't the religion that we wanted at the time in the 1850s. What publishers were often charged with is something called obscene libel, under which the publishers have to be found guilty of the intention to deprave or corrupt the reader. The man behind most of these prosecutions is a gentleman called Mervyn Griffith Jones. He is Eton educated, Cambridge educated, served in the war with distinction, was a prosecutor at Nuremberg, and upon his return to Britain gets a bee in his bonnet about obscene publications. Often what would happen is the police will go to premises such as a newsagent somewhere selling books, and they will find the book that a complaint has been made about. But the police were on their own recognizance to also pick up any other material that they might deem to be obscene. And they make a beeline for the pulp books because they have suggestive covers, suggestive titles, and passages where there is violence. What they don't have to do is ever bring into record that they have brought a charge against that book. They've got the book that they came for. Anything else is just collateral damage. It gets taken to the police station, it gets destroyed. In the courtroom, and I am massively oversimplifying things, the prosecution is very much cherry picking the evidence it wishes the juries to see, and in this they seem to be backed up by the judiciary. There is one specific case which is covered in the Mushroom Jungle, which is about Hank Jansen, who at that point had probably sold 10 million books. Now, a lot of books, the guy, Stephen Francis, was an absolute writing machine. These books would be selling 60, 70,000 copies for each, but they just keep coming and coming. They choose 7 of these books. They cherry pick the books, and then they cherry pick passages of the books. And the judge gives the jury 4 hours to go away and read those 7 books and decide whether they're obscene. The defence, quite naturally, objects that that is not long enough. They're given a little bit of extra time, and when the jury returns, the judge asks them if they've found a verdict. They've been told by the foreman, not found a verdict. The judge then lectures the jury on the cost of rerunning trials and the expense and the waste and the dangers of exposing more jurors to this kind of terrible literature, and essentially gets them to reconsider. Will another 5 or 10 minutes do? They come back and they find the publishers guilty. The firm is fined £2,000 and the publishers are put into jail for between 6 and 9 months respectively. The arguments against this raised by the defence, I've got to say I'm in favour of them. The first is context of the book itself. The jury was obviously not given enough time to look at the book as a whole. There are plenty of books which may have a moral standpoint, and I'm not arguing that Hank Jansen does. But if you take certain passages from those books and present them in isolation, you're going to have a very different opinion of the book to having read the whole thing. Their second argument is one of context in the time. Basically saying that the rule, the act, the law is a little bit outdated. And citing examples of books which had previously been found to be obscene under that act back in the 19-teens and 1920s that were now freely available in the shops. And they cited 2 in specifically, Ulysses by James Joyce and The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. And the judge rejects that argument. This gives the publishers a brief boost, because having books banned is absolute catnip to the reading public, who will find those books. But the rate of prosecutions and the amount of the fines began to take its toll. Firms started to go out of business, publishers and printers ending up with jail sentences. But then a couple of things happen. Griffiths-Jones loses a case. In 54 or 57, they take the publishers Heinemann to court to prosecute them for obscenity for a book by William Baxter called The Image and the Search. William Baxter is also Cambridge educated, and he beats the case, possibly because he is able to present himself as, something a bit more above, a cut above these gutter snipes with their mushroom publishing. And a Labour Member of Parliament called Roy Jenkins brings a bill in to update, a private member's bill, I believe, to update the Obscene Publications Act. And in 1959, the new Obscene Publications Act is brought into force. And this act specifically mandates that if you are going to try a piece of work, you have to take the whole work into context. By this point, the mushroom publishers are pretty much dead in the water, but it doesn't stop Griffiths-Jones going after Penguin. And this is probably the most celebrated of the Obscene Publication Act trials, but crucially under the new Obscene Publications Act, to try them for obscenity for Lady Chatterley's lover. Now, there are a few things against Griffith-Jones by this point, so I don't think he realises. One is, it's now 1960. Times are changing. I know they didn't change on January the 1st, 1960, but in general, society had progressed a bit more, even in the last 5 years. Secondly, the H. Lawrence is much more an established literary figure than anybody he's tried to prosecute up until now. And thirdly, he torpedoes himself in his opening remarks to the jury. Famously, he asks that the jury is going to be asked whether this Lady Chatterley's lover is a fit book that you would allow your wife or your servant to read. And I'm going to suggest that not many in the jury had servants. Some may have had servants in their family, but they would have been the servants and would not have taken kindly to being told what they were allowed to read. I think maybe the wives also would have seen themselves in that camp. Now, maybe Griffith-Jones had a specific reason to phrase what he said in the way that he said it, and possibly it's the plot of Lady Chatterley's lover, where it is actions of the servant and the wife that are the plot. But he just painted himself as out of touch by that point. The Act stayed in place. There were future prosecutions under that Act, but that's a story for another day. The dam really broke with Lady Chatterley's lover, but the first chips in that dam started to appear in the Hank Jansen trial. But like I said, by this point, and I think certainly by the end of 1957, the majority of the mushroom publishers were gone. A lot of it was to do with the prosecutions that were brought. Some people were in jail, other firms had been put into bankruptcy. But in 1957 there's also a printer's strike, and those firms that had been able to weather the storm up until that point, the majority of them could not survive this prolonged stoppage of not being able to publish anything. Also by this point, a new International Copyright Act agreement had come into play, and this meant that it was a lot easier for American writers to get their work published in the UK without any copyright issues. Also, import restrictions had been lifted, and the British public found out that the people who were really good at authentic American voices in literature were Americans. So not many firms survived. Hamilton and Company, one of the first, actually fared best or better than most. It had changed its name even during the Second World War to Panther Books, and Panther Books had a healthy pipeline of business and didn't become too embroiled in all the obscenity issues. However, Panther was later taken over by Granada, who in turn were taken over by HarperCollins. World Distributors became Viking Books for a while, then WDL Books, then became Console Books, and then I think went out of business or were bought out by something called Pentos Group. John Spencer became Badger Books, became Cobra Books, and sort of fizzled out. A bit more of a convoluted story, but Trident Books came out of Harborough. That company imported a number of the Ace Doubles paperbacks. They then changed their name to Ace Books, even though they had nothing to do with the Ace books in the United States. They were then sold to Foursquare, who were sold to or became the New American Library, who changed their name to the New English Library, who were bought by Hodder and Stoughton, and remained as an imprint until 2004, where they became part of the Hachette imprint under the Hodder umbrella. Ward Brown became Digit books, and Digit were very successful in the 50s and early 60s. They had a run of westerns, they had a run of science fiction books. They were at the forefront of war novels, for the Second World War. They also managed to court a little bit of controversy themselves by bringing in controversial names from the States, like William Lee, otherwise known as William Burroughs. They printed Junkie, and I think the Digit edition of Junkie goes for stupid money. And also Henry Miller with Tropic of Cancer, and all of those books that I can't imagine have being able to get published in the 1950s under the watchful eye of Mervyn Griffith Jones. But Digit books became Brown Watson again, and in 1971 were taken over by Warner Brothers, who then spun it off to another firm, who then sold that particular part, the publisher, and became Brown Watson once more. It still exists, and it now produces very young children's books and colouring books. So it's a bit of a sad ending in a way, but I don't want to end this on a sad note, because these books were just so much fun. So I want to end talking about a writer who I think really sums that up. And that writer is Lionel Fanthorpe, who wrote for Badger Books. He wrote 180 books for Badger Books. There was another man called Glasby, who wrote even more. But I think Fanthorpe is the more colourful character, and the one who is remembered, and the one who was the blatant self-publicist. So I've already shown one of his books, and that was From Realms Beyond. Another one I have is under the name Carl Siegfried, Barrier 346. Both of these books written by the same man, both of these books 158 pages long. Badger Books, always happy to sell, advertise Joan the Wad. I always thought it was Joan the Wad, but then I saw a poem earlier today, and it's Joan the Wad. Here is an earlier, before Badger Books, this is John Spencer. Tales of Tomorrow, 1 shilling and sixpence. And you can see that Joan the Wad has been a mainstay of advertising with John Spencer and other of the mushroom publishers for years and years. Well, I've read enough of these now to have noticed Joan turning up everywhere. Joan is a good luck charm. Joan is a Cornish, well, it's a pixie, but they call it in Cornwall a piskie. And the charm that they send out is guaranteed to have been dipped in the lucky saint's well. They've not advertised for decades, as you can imagine, but you can still pick them up for a couple of pounds on eBay. So I have my own Joan the Wad. You can tell it's Joan the Wad because it's got Joan the Wad written on the back. It needs a bit of a clean. It's a little bit tarnished, but I don't want to rub away the luck. So I'll let you know how my luck holds out. Back to Lionel. Lionel Fanthorpe wrote Rodent Mutation, which sells now for about £500. If you ever see a copy, snap it up. it is the sine qua non of post-war pulp publishing. It's the absolute platonic ideal of trash literature, as well as a writer. And I had to write these down because there's quite a bit of stuff here. Lionel Fanthorpe was also a van driver, paranormal researcher, journalist, teacher and head teacher, army instructor, TV presenter, a vicar, a judo black belt of the 5th Dan, the former president of the British UFO Research Association and the current president of the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomenon. He still writes. The books he writes are now more on the supernatural side, and his wife was fully credited. She was always involved with the writing, but never got her name on the cover. To be fair, Lionel rarely got his name on the cover. Here's a list of the pseudonyms I've managed to find. Neil Balfour, Othello Barron, Earl Barton, Lee Barton, Thornton Bell, Leo Brett, Brom Fane, Mel J, Marston Johns, L.P. Kenton, Victor LaSalle, Oban Lertef, Robert Lionel, John E. Muller, Elton T. Neef, Phil Nobel, Peter O'Flynn, John Raymond, Lionel Roberts, Rene Rolat, my favourite, Deutero Spartacus, Robin Tate, Neil Thanet, Trevor Thorpe, Trebor Thorpe, Pel Toro, Olaf Trent, Carl Siegfried, as well as his own name. So during the 1950s and the 1960s, he wrote 160 books for Badger Books. 89 of those 180 books were written in a 3-year period. If you work that out, it means that's a new book every 12 days on average. That's crazy. And he's still with us, so I'm going to be kind, but I'm sure he would probably agree it's not the greatest literature in the world. It's a lot of fun. It's rambunctious. It's memorable, but it's not the greatest writing. The dialogue sometimes seems to have a life of its own and needs to be brought back to the story. More specifically, and this is a hallmark that, having only read a half dozen, I am noticing, and that's that they end very abruptly. His method of writing was to dictate everything. This is another writer where the sheets would come back to him, and when he realised that he's getting near to the 158 page limit, because they're all 158 pages, he'll end the book. He'll find a way to wrap everything up very quickly. Well, I say wrap everything up. He finds a way to finish the book quickly. But the fertile imagination that is there is quite something. Often he was presented with a picture, a title, and a genre, and told to get at it. Badger books were nothing if not tight-fisted. Often the actual pictures were reused pictures from American publications. And I've noticed this. I read Trebor Thorpe Lightning World, and then I saw the same cover turn up again in Andre Norton. And that's not the only time that I have seen it, but it's the only example I can remember at the moment. But parsimonious as they were, it couldn't be kept as a going concern. And in a world of takeovers, mergers, acquisitions, rebranding, and homogenization, we've lost something. I'm not saying that what we lost was always the greatest thing, but it was ours. Born out of the necessities of rationing and restriction, the publishing industry had their own make, do, amend attitude and approach to reusing what it could from stories, from pictures, reusing old plots and hackneyed dialogue, reusing whatever paper they could get their hands on. But eventually the luck lets them down. The most annoying thing about all of this is that some of the stuff that we have lost is pretty much lost forever. There were no reprints. These were articles of fairly poor quality, or throwaway literature that has been thrown away or has deteriorated over time. The few decent copies that I see go for silly prices. There's no big rush to reprint these. These are not even books, due to the nature of their publication, where a copy was lodged with the British Library. Some of these publishers would have thought that's too extravagant an expense. Trying to piece together the information is, even in this day and age, incredibly difficult. And Steve Holland's book does a great job in doing that. But it's not exhaustive. I think some of these books we will never know who actually wrote them. We can have a pretty good idea, but there's no certainty. There's certainly no ebooks or anthologies. It was simply thrown away like the trash it is. But we love our trash. I love my trash. So I'm just going to keep an eye out at every bookstall and car boot that I go to. And if the book's in a bad state, then I'll just get the sellotape out. I hope I'm wrong about some of this. I hope that there are pockets of information there and I've just not come across them yet. I don't know enough about these publishers yet. To be honest, it's only when I've started getting properly into booktube that I worry about things like publishers. I mean, I know I should do, because I understand it with record companies, but the personalities of publishing companies and the personalities of the commissioning editors is something I'm still exploring and playing a lot of catch up on. So if you don't want to listen to me witter on about it, a really good resource on YouTube is Phil Harbottle, who knows his stuff and has actually walked the walk. I'll link his channel below. It's lots of interesting information, and he's got a wonderful collection. Maybe I'll find some good copies somewhere. I'll rub my wad and wish for luck. Until then, bye.